Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to the designer Dan Hill. Dan's work spans interaction design, strategic design, urban design, systems design, teaching, writing. He's currently a director at Arup and was previously a part of the Helsinki Design Lab with Brian Boyer, who you may remember I interviewed a few months ago. And Brian and I talked a lot about strategic design, and Dan also worked with Brian and actually wrote a really great book about strategic design called Dark Matter and Trojan Horses that I just really can't recommend enough. He was also the director of Fabrica for a bit and has taught in various design schools. But my first introduction to Dan was actually through his blog, City of Sound, which he's kept up for almost 20 years now and is just this really fascinating repository of his thinking on subjects ranging from architecture to web design to travel to reading. He's just consistently been one of my favorite writers on design and design-related subjects. And in this conversation, Dan and I kind of talk about all of that. We talk about why designer is still even the best description for his work. We talk about his move from interaction design to strategic design to systems design and kind of where his thinking is now. We also talk about his thoughts on a new kind of design education, as well as the role of writing in his own work and his own design practice. This conversation was just so interesting to me. He's thinking about design at just a completely different level. And as much as I've enjoyed his writing over the years, I just found this discussion to be just completely kind of energizing and inspiring and fascinating. I think this is a really good one. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. Those memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy my conversation with Dan Hill. I was thinking about this conversation and thinking about you and your work and what I wanted to talk to you about. And you've had such an interesting career, at least from someone kind of looking over all the different types of work that you've done that's spanned disciplines, spanned fields. And so I kind of want to start just kind of right in the heart of that. When you're at a party or when you're introducing yourself to somebody, what do you say that you do, or how do you define your job?
Well, yeah, I'm a parent, so I never go to parties these days unless they're kids' parties.
Right,
so,
true. Okay.
In which case I'll say I'm a dad.
All right, that works.
But yeah, I guess I say designer actually, and then usually I can either leave it at that and then run away, or someone will say, "Oh, cool, what kind of designer?" And then it immediately gets complicated.
Right.
So I'll then talk about, well, I'm depending on who I'm with, I might say, well, I work with cities a lot, but then immediately, of course, the more clued up will say, "So you're an architect?" And I'll say, no, I'm not really, but I'm not at all, technically. Although I've hung around them long enough that I can speak lingo and, it might smell like an architect occasionally. But, I do some things that are in the ballpark, but then equally I'm deliberately not, I'm absolutely not. Mm-hmm. So yes, it immediately gets a bit complicated. Then I might say, and someone else might say I'm an interaction designer, which is what I am technically, I guess, if I had a trade, if I had a single discipline specialism within the field of design that I can say I've done, to some proficient level of degree or whatever, then it's certainly interaction design. That defined certainly the early stage, much of the early stages of my career, and I think like one of them. Other times it depends. I might even say service designer because actually a lot of my work now is hovering more towards the service design end of stuff. And then if it's really a conversation I can dig into,
that's what this is.
Yeah, I might say strategic designer.
Okay.
And then that, that really confuses people. But it's, that's really what I've ended up thinking about a lot. Again, now the first half of my career was defined around interaction design. The second half thus far has been around strategic design. But I'm really fluidly moving between things, and that's again why strategic design isn't a bad title at the end of the day, because it's not terribly well defined. It means you can be quite flexible with it. But yeah, certainly my work is at multiple scales simultaneously sometimes.
Yeah,
and so it jumps up and down that thing.
I mean, that's kind of, as I was thinking about your career. And something that I was struck by is how there's been this kind of consistent scaling up, it seems like, in the types of work, starting with what I'm going to call kind of traditional interaction design, up to working with cities and thinking about cities. And so I kind of, maybe it'd be helpful to kind of go back in time or kind of go over the background a little bit. Did you study interaction design, or how did this word design become, or designer become, the term that best fits what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't train as a designer, so I'm self-taught from a practice point of view. But then, I've done it long enough now that I can kind of hold my own.
Right.
And you end up teaching it. It's one of those things. It's kind of, there are many great designers, obviously, that also weren't trained as designers, who are much, more proficient at design than I am. But it's certainly not something even that existed when I was actually at college first time round. You couldn't do interaction design and service design. It didn't exist. It's what I trained as, what I did at college, if that helps. I did a computer science degree to begin with.
Okay.
And then on that, there were certainly bits of that degree course that I gravitated towards. And so, human-computer interaction was a module on that degree. And I found it endlessly interesting. And I think that, that sowed the seeds for it. But I'd say even going back further than that, I was kind of using a computer from very early days and using it to draw with when I was, 12 years old. And this was in like 1982, 83. So this was early days of Apple II in this country. In the UK, the Sinclair Spectrum, which is a bit like the Commodore 64 equivalent. Really early home computing, personal computing stuff, when I was drawing bits pixel by pixel on a screen.
Yeah.
So there was an attempt to do that from a very early days.
Right.
And I don't know quite where that came from, but just an interest in that. And then computer science became that. And then I graduated from that and worked for a year in a city council in Manchester, 2 years actually, and then went back to college and did a master's in urban sociology.
Okay.
And that's when the interest in cities started emerging. And I think also this, the human-centered perspective that I got a little bit on computer science, I would then, bust out a bit more with sociology and begin to talk about networks and people and relationships and cities and so on.
Yeah.
So that was a thing. And then after that, it was very much working on the urban regeneration of Manchester, but the perspective I was looking at it from, and this was sort of mid-90s, was the really early days of the web, and then beginning to think through, well, how does that change the way that people do what they do? How does it change the way that, like, a graphic designer in Manchester in 1996 would change the way that she was doing that work? And it was, I would approach that from a sociological perspective. It happened to be, though, at the time, then I thought, well, actually, the way to figure out the way the web changes what someone does is to build a website with them.
Right, yeah.
Like, who the hell knows? Like, is this thing going to catch on?
Yeah.
Like, we just didn't know.
Right.
So I ended up designing and building websites with people, because you could in those days, just, using code almost copied from magazines and view source on other websites and stuff.
And this is like mid-90s now, about?
Yeah, 95, 96. So I ended up building a website for this bit of the city centre. It was called the Northern Quarter Network. It was one of the really early websites around a physical place. So like the idea of a place having a website, that was sort of very unusual, relatively actually. There was another one in Europe. Amsterdam had one, and then we had this one in Manchester. There were probably some in the US. I don't know where they were though, but. Simultaneously, you can see like a lot of things in my career kind of coming from that moment. And I realized that actually I was kind of enjoying the design more than the research, or rather, I was enjoying being a designer more than I was enjoying being an academic. I was sort of an academic at that point.
Oh, okay.
And so I realized actually, I could do this web design lark for a living more, and the other stuff will find a way to kind of surface itself.
When did that word design when did you become aware of that word design, or that designer was, all of these interests that you had, you were kind of circling this. When were you able to narrow in on that, or how did that start to kind of emerge for you?
Good question. I mean, round about then.
Okay.
Round about then, there were a lot of things going on. There was, in the UK anyway, a very strong graphic design scene at that time, dominated by, people like Designers Republic or Vaughan Oliver or, sort of very, Malcolm Garrett was still doing stuff, sort of very interesting Peter Saville set of designers around at that time. And my work was about, the creative scenes in cities and the relationship between, say, design and cities and things like that. And I was in Manchester, and Manchester and Sheffield. Warp Records was from Sheffield. Designers Republic were in Sheffield. Manchester had Peter Saville and Malcolm Garrett. The relationship between a record label, a graphic design firm, the city, and then what became the internet. It was all incredibly fluid.
Yeah.
And there's a very strong kind of independent scene in the UK around that kind of stuff.
Right.
So it was, because it was independent, therefore it was relatively accessible. It was a post-punk spirit of thinking, well, we could all do something a bit like that. And so you end up designing flyers for your mate's club night at the Hacienda,
Right.
Peter Saville or anything, but basically, you're kind of in the same scene.
Yeah.
Even in a very accessible domestic kind of way. So I realized that I was doing design informally, and that's when I started basically schooling myself just by buying Emigre magazine or reading, just a lot of reading, a lot of trying things out. I mean, some horrible stuff I would have designed at that time.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, all of us have at that time.
Yeah, exactly. But because I think I was self-conscious of it for a while as well. I hadn't gotten through a design background, and so I had no sense of things like grid systems. Like, how the hell would I know? So that was something that had to be pointed out to me at one point, gently, and then I thought, oh, I better go and learn about that stuff. But meanwhile, the internet was still in this very DIY mode, obviously. Like, people were literally like view source on a website, hack something together, see what happens. And there were no particular guidelines and rules around that. Right. It felt like a very open field.
Yeah.
And then, so you could get a long way quite quickly, actually, in those days. It was kind of open territory in a way that formerly, say, graphic design wasn't so open, actually. Web design was a much more open to an outsider, if you're in that sense. And because I knew enough technically, because I had a computer science degree behind me, and I was part of a scene that was then very fluid around creative industries, then it became something one did, and you sort of trained your way through it. And then you get to the point where I was then designing websites for the music industry down in London, and again, learning from other designers I was working alongside in a very, very small, early stages, what we would have called then new media company, building websites for Virgin Records and EMI, and to some extent, bluffing my way through that, but realizing at some point, actually, I'm okay at this, and realizing there was a certain kind of design aesthetic that I was interested in or comfortable with, and matched what a bunch of people wanted at the time. Then I shifted to the BBC and then moved into something that, ultimately, that was kind of the consolidation of that as a career, if you like. Previously, I guess I could have gone in a number of different directions, and if we'd had that conversation now, I mean, people would have been talking about things like startups and stuff like that, and I had no particular interest in that then, probably now, but I certainly could have gone in multiple directions at that point. But I think it was something that, moving to the BBC, I realized actually then this is like proper, and I started then ultimately running teams, and then running a team of like 50 or 60, and realizing I'm the design lead for iPlayer, which is the BBC's big on-demand media thing, along with a couple of other senior design figures in the organization. And that's 10 years later. So in that 10 years, that's a lot of kind of practice under my belt by that point.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me. I'm a bit younger than you, but I was in high school in the early 2000s, and this was kind of right when I grew up in the suburbs, and so I remember when we got internet access. And so my first introduction to graphic design was online, and it was through blogs like Design Observer, Speak Up, and then I subscribed to Immigrant and kind of did all of that. And so my early design education was very rooted in the kind of theory writing side, but then I didn't know anything about grids or kerning or anything like that. And so then when I went to school to study design, I kind of thought I knew everything. I had all those immigrants in my back pocket, and then realized I didn't know how to actually do any of it.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And so how did you find that your, for lack of a better word, non-traditional background or coming from outside design, how did that influence either how you approached design or what your design looked like, or how you even thought about what design was?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a few things there. One, I don't really thought about this coherently, but I suspect something around the ability to understand the technical, almost it's actually philosophy of the internet, and then address that in the design. Because again, I had that comp sci degree. Not that I was a brilliant computer scientist at all by any means. I was very much drawn towards the human end of that spectrum.
Yeah.
But I remember reading a book by Paul Durish some years later about the foundations of embodied interaction, and I realized that conceptually I had a pretty good understanding of a relatively deep level of the way that computers work, the way that networks work, the way that systems work. And then the ability to then think of HTML in terms of separating content from presentation and modular design, adaptive design, all of those things were very natural things for me to get after. So although I was sort of at a surface level attracted to, on the one hand, these very rich aesthetics, again, on the one end, like the likes of Vaughan Oliver or Designers Republic, these very intense, visceral aesthetics, or Emigre for that matter, David Carson and so on. On the other end of that, then, as usual, the Swiss modernists and all of those things, equally like drawn towards those things aesthetically.
Yeah.
My instinct as a designer, I found where I was most useful, was really in this more conceptual level, which was systems, and then people's interaction with those things, because that had been my background, which happened to then turn into a discipline called interaction design or service design. But it was coincidence. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that being the autodidact, like self-taught in that sense, you're really reaching out and grasping references and reading from all over the place. And I'd always done that as well. I'd had this very kind of diverse character, I think, as a person, maybe, but certainly, I was never going to be, I'm a science guy or I'm a humanities guy. It's kind of interested in both and would reach across freely from all of them, and arguably, probably relatively shallow understanding of each one.
Right. Yeah.
But the ability to kind of maneuver across that field, I think, also meant that when it then surfaced later, many years later, that I remember people have said to me, for a designer, you read a lot, my references that I would be reaching for might come from, I don't know, it sounds horribly pretentious, but like modernist literature, theory, as much as Japanese architecture, as much as football. And that's something that I found repeatedly useful and just naturally. It's not something I've really had to inculcate or work at. It's just been the way that I see the world. I think those two things then define the kind of designer that I am. I'm not the person you go to for a deep understanding of the difference between the letter E in Helvetica and Air. I can do that, but at a basic level, I'm not that. But there are many people better at that than I am. But my ability is probably to jump contexts relatively quickly. And then that meant that my career has been then defined around, I sometimes think of it as kind of like, the end of, I guess it's Apocalypse Now, where the guy is kind of riding the atom bomb from the plane.
Yeah.
Sorry, not Apocalypse Now, Dr. Strangelove. And I kind of feel like I've just ridden the internet into industry after industry, and that's the ability then to sort of understand something in the music industry, and then jump to the media industry, and then jump to architecture and built environment, and then from there to Finland, where I did it in sort of in government, social innovation, and then Italy was about the same education sector, right. And then back to the UK and so on. And it's basically the same maneuvers each time, but in a completely different context each time. So it's kind of, deeply, quickly understanding something, grasping hold of it, building a framework that makes sense, and being able to substitute in and out quite freely.
Yeah,
that's something that defines, I think, the kind of way I think about design.
And that it's interesting, and I think if someone looked over your resume, they would see this kind of career as at a superficial level, a career as an interaction designer, and then this kind of quick turn into these kind of bigger ideas. And I think the way you're talking about it is, and I don't mean to put silos around, the difference between interaction or strategic or service, but it's almost like for you, it's this kind of widening of what these terms mean, or a blurring of the line between these. And I think something like strategic design in Helsinki is just an exaggerated form of interaction design. Potentially.
I think I see them as a continuum, really, or a series of shifting scales, perhaps as much as anything. In that, I keep meaning to draw this diagram. I haven't got around to it ever. But like an interaction design is designing a particular touch point, a particular experience. It's quite discrete and focused. And I, as a designer, I love nothing more actually than doing that. Sometimes, I still spend the late night, early morning in design, making a newspaper or
interesting,
pushing pixels on a website. It's just that my output for those things is something other than it was like 15 years ago when I was making it, because it was the BBC. Someone was about to use that service,
right.
But anyway. So I certainly still am drawn to the interaction design end of it. I endlessly be interested in product design, interaction design, the crafting of why a control knob versus a switch is an important discussion in and of itself. Then I think the service design, which is the orchestration of a series of touch points into a coherent experience, one way or another. Clearly, you can see that is relevant in my career in a few different places, certainly at the BBC, but we were thinking about those things very early on in that world, actually, even, like musical experiences or media experiences that are shifting from physical to digital to out in the streets to back at home. And we couldn't do a lot of that stuff at the time because we didn't have the tech to do it. But, it was clearly that was where it was going immediately, as soon as we could do it. And then, of course, in buildings and cities and things, that's really relevant. Like how people interact with a bus or a building is a service design question.
Right.
And then the strategic design bit is then zooming further out and getting into this stuff about the dark matter, which is that how do you then scale that equitably or scale that across a system so you can change a system, which is, again, that's more like a nested thing. These are interaction, service, strategy, zooms up and down that
right.
And it's where, again, this sounds pretentious, but it's kind of like thinking about urban design by starting at the level of the doorknob, and then looking up the city, and then back zooming up and down again. And it's why I always got on well with people like Brian and Rory, because they're both architects by training and then also comfortable with that zooming. I think there's certain kinds of design disciplines, industrial design, architecture, interaction design, which are intrinsically about that zoom in scales and multiple integrated systems moving in and out. But I see that I can see as a continuum, the strategic design layer, the strategy, the way that something scales or spreads or changes a system is really powerfully informed by being able to think about the individual interactions. It just makes the strategy better if you understand the importance of execution and bringing users and user research into the way you define strategy. So that's been really useful. And conversely, the other way, if you're designing an interaction and then able to think about, well, how does that spread or scale, or maybe it doesn't scale, that's equally a strategic choice. But that feels always very comfortable to me. And then so the conversation I had this morning with another designer here at Arup was speculative design. And it's a tool that I've used numerous times, but I really think, well, speculative design is just like a ratchet or like a time slider on those things.
Oh, interesting.
So we can say, like, you've got this interaction service strategy stuff, and then if let's like ratchet up the speculative design dial to 20 years, then for sure it becomes this very propositional speculative thing. But maybe you can do that. We made a short film for a project last year, just an internal design process, and we just looked at how are people going to call autonomous shuttles, just looking at like the 2 or 3 interactions required to make that happen. They don't really exist in the way that we did it, and so we spoofed interfaces, we chose certain things just because they weren't relevant and focused on other things, and we're making the film to flush out the questions. It's not to say this is the interaction, it's just to flush out the questions around the interactions. Equally, did a session last week with Stockholm City Council, and when he's saying, so what's the 21st century city making team? That's a strategic design question, and it's with the speculative design like slider.
That's so interesting.
It's,
Yeah.
Scroll it forward, and then it's a kind of, maybe the team has like a writer in it and a psychologist, as well as an architect. It enables you to have that freer conversation. Yeah. And then you can roll that back to today. You like ratchet it back, because then you want to say, well, yeah, but what about next week?
Right.
I'm not satisfied to do the speculative design thing for an end in itself. It's just, I want to kind of free up the thinking in order to then pull it back to today.
Yeah.
So I kind of group those 3 disciplines as like nested Russian dolls almost. The interaction service strategy thing, and then speculative is like a slider you can move up and down into the future. I don't know if that was what your question was.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was so. I don't even care, because that to me that actually helped me articulate a lot of things. Just both in this conversation and the way that I've been thinking about them more generally. And I think the scale of speculative, kind of adding that on, because speculative design is something that comes up on this podcast a lot, and kind of how that fits in. And you just articulated that in a way that I haven't been able to yet.
It's funny to draw the diagram, but it's it helps me understand it in that way, because we have a team here at Arup called Foresight who do the kind of long-term thinking, and I'm trying to articulate what we do, which is a design team working on buildings and spaces and infrastructure and services and all kinds of things. And I'm trying to, kind of get the sense that the future has kind of crashed into the present, where in the 60s, 70s, 80s, this kind of foresight thing was about scenario planning, and let's do a guess of what 2030 looks like, that kind of stuff. I'm always trying to pull it back to today now, and then there's just that differentiator there, just saying that all design is in the future, by definition. Like, we're all making something that doesn't quite exist yet, and it's just a question of is this thing coming out next week? Like, are you working on a book layout that's going to come out in 6 months, or are you working on the future of books?
Right.
Which is for like a speculative thing for 25 years time. And so, they're both in the future. Yeah. It's just a sense of what's the time scale,
Yeah. That is, I don't have anything else to say about that, because I feel like you've just articulated everything that I've been trying to kind of figure out. And something, I got really fascinated by strategic design after I talked to Brian Boyer, and he and I kind of really talked about it at length, about kind of what it means and what it is. And then
I learned so much from him as well. I mean, he was, one of my key work partners.
Right.
For a very kind of short period of time in a way, but a very intense period. We kind of basically figured out a lot of this stuff, I think, together through endlessly trudging through the snow in Helsinki, talking and talking and talking.
Right. And then after I talked to him, I then read your kind of book essay, Dark Matter and Trojan Horses, which I could easily talk to you about that for an hour in and of itself. I marked that up a lot. But something that's I would like to kind of just touch on quickly, because I did talk to Brian about it, and you talk about it in the book, but the kind of opposition or the I don't know the word exactly, but how these things that we're talking about now are different than design thinking. And I know you've written a lot about kind of, you know, I don't want to say the failures or the problems with design thinking, but how this is different, and how practicing design in this way is different than what has now been billed or sold as design thinking. And I was wondering if you could just kind of articulate that a little bit here, just to kind of show how those are different, or you know, how the outcome is different.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one, because I don't want to imply that design thinking is necessarily bad per se.
Right.
It was, you know, there was stuff I was writing at the time was written at the height of folks like IDEO, selling a very clear service around that. And of course, there are brilliant thinkers and designers at IDEO. And so I don't want to kind of cast a pall over the whole thing at all. But what I felt was kind of getting a bit out of hand was the slightly lazy kind of extrapolation from the sense that everybody is a designer, which I would buy into in a sense, as in, you know, the Bernard Radowski kind of, I was very interested in the early days in vernacular architecture, for instance, when it came to architecture, equally interested in modernist architecture, but you know, it's just sort of, that was very interesting because of the kind of design background I had, which was this systems built together that iterate over time, and learning goes through the systems and so on. And it was also slightly DIY. So that was very interesting. So I'm very comfortable with the idea of at a basic everyday level, and, you know, sort of Victor Papanak kind of way, everybody is a designer. Fantastic. I'm equally comfortable with the level of people in business or government or others understanding ways of thinking that are, you might say, designerly. And, you know, being open to multiple ways of thinking, understanding the techniques, understanding the likely value of it. Of course, I'm interested in that. You know, basically, I'm a designer. I'm selling my skills to them. It's going to be beneficial to me professionally if they understand what the hell they're buying and why it's valuable. You know, so I equally, the idea of raising a level of design literacy generally, fantastic also. And I massively appreciate when I'm in a culture, let's say Sweden or the Netherlands or Japan or Finland, where the level of design literacy at the basic populace level is almost like background radiation. It's just good. At a basic level, you know, makes everything a lot better. So that's all good. The lazy reach is then saying that then everybody can be a professional designer, or everybody can do things that a professional designer does, or that level of literacy is enough right there. And that kind of gets problematic because, first of all, it implies in a funny way that, you know, design thinking is like this magic bullet that you can pick up over a week-long course, and then suddenly you're thinking in a completely different way, and all of the world's problems, you know, just become simple. That doesn't happen, as we know. You know, and that was almost the implicit promise that you just send your C-level management to a design thinking course. They'll come back and, you know, they have a series of magic bullets they can fire at problems. And of course they don't, because they are the same people with the same job title they had before. Their inbox is now 5 days bigger than it was 5 days ago. They've still got the same problems, and they're not really able to address anything coherently in that way. Equally, design doing to me was, you know, is very different to design thinking. And in the design making doing kind of nexus is, as we know, like where we figure out a lot of the stuff. It's not in the pure thinking area, because we're thinking through making and designing, and you know, we can all think about problems very easily. The thought is the easy bit often. It's the making and the doing of stuff that is hard for various reasons. So I think that's where I want to say. So at some point, then you need to hire a professional designer. I'd rather see a C-level team go on a design thinking course. Maybe that's totally fine. Have a very increased level of design literacy. If it's done well, fantastic.
Yeah.
But then the response might be, for instance, then hire a chief design officer and build a design culture in the firm. That would be, or the council. That would be a far more beneficial maneuver, as opposed to not doing that and assuming that, great, we've got design covered.
Yeah.
We're all good.
Yeah.
And I know that it's very delicate, this thing, because I don't want to then imply that from a professional designer's point of view, like you or I, that we have some magic skills that other people don't have. But nonetheless, your training as a designer is meaningful, right? And your practice then as a designer is meaningful, just in the same way as the practice of someone who's had a financial accountancy background. That's also meaningful. There's also a deep practice there. Designers don't understand that enough, for instance.
Yeah.
So it's not that it's better or worse or anything. And that was the other thing that I found problematic about design thinking. It was kind of oversold, again, as if it was this magic skill that you could just inherit.
Yeah.
And I think, A, you can't, and B, it wouldn't make a blind difference even if you could, because it turns out you also need all those other skills anyway.
Right.
Like if your whole workforce started thinking like a designer, it would be a disaster.
Right.
You wouldn't get anything done.
Right.
So the analogy I was looking at in my essay was, as with food, I usually come back to that. It's great that people know about food more than they did in the 70s. So that's beneficial to everybody. If people are cooking Thai food at home, amazing. People are buying better cooking equipment, cooking with a wider and diverse range of things, eating healthier food. Shows like MasterChef, I think, are actually fantastic because they raise a level of literacy about food. That is only ever a good thing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can still go to a restaurant and have a professional chef cook your dinner, right? And that is something else. I will never be able to do what he or she does unless, frankly, I practiced the crap out of it for years.
Right.
So that's the thing. And they're both good. So amateur chef at home, fine. Go and visit a professional chef when you want to do that. It's the same with design. It's as simple as that. And you know what I mean? And design things just suddenly kind of implied that, okay, amateur chef, you can do what a professional chef does. In fact, you don't need the professional chef anymore. And that's the end of it. We're all good.
I'm curious what you think, because over the course of your career, design has kind of gained a bigger and bigger kind of cultural currency where people at least at a base level, understand the importance or the value of design or having a design team. And I think design thinking, despite everything you said, does get some credit for kind of raising the public consciousness of design. Yeah. And, your career shows that, of moving from kind of working on screen to cities to systems, kind of how design can fit into that. And that contrast between everyone being a designer versus, having the designers. And I've been struggling with articulating this idea of everyone being a designer, which I do agree with at that base level.
At the everyday vernacular level of, we all pick out curtains and move our furniture around, and we're choosing to do this action versus that action with some kind of sequence of steps in mind, at that basic level.
And so my question is, where is that balance? This is a big question that I don't expect you to actually have a very clear answer on, but that balance between design permeating everything, not as colonizers, but also not completely as kind of democratizing design. It has to kind of fall in the middle there somewhere, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as usually most things, it's like a matter of degrees, which is why it's hard to articulate in a pithy way, because it's frankly much easier to say design thinking is going to solve the industry, and it's like, well, it's an absolutist statement. It's not really like that, and equally, it's not the same as just hiring a CDO and then you're done. It's always going to be somewhere in between. So I think, there's this thing about the way that then you do design. If you were a chief design officer, which I have been in places, and it's the way that you articulate that is really a delicate balancing act, because one of the things designers can do is integrative thinking, pull people around topics in different ways, propositional or synthetic capabilities. It's not just analysis, it's actually, proposing different scenarios. If you do that in a way that is enabling other people to be part of that process, effectively co-designing without them having to be the professional designer, means the professional designer's job is one of then nurturing, stimulating, guiding, proposing. It's a very different type of designer. It's not the traditional sort of authorial figure of the maestro in the old sense, the person that will make all the choices for you, and that's what you get. So again, from my background, very much, it's much more of this kind of how do we integrate multiple moving parts around possible better versions of today, and take people with you, because I'm interested then in scaling that, or I'm interested in that happening, and I think there's more chance of that happening if people have been part of the process. The process is going to be richer because other people have been part of the process. So it's a different kind of designer in that sense, which I think takes the heat off what I said previously, because you could read what I said previously as in a very patronizing way. Sure, you will pick out curtains, but you're not a real professional designer. So that I would couch that in the sense that, so the job now of the real professional designer is not to be that old maestro, this dictator at all, but actually their job is deeply involved in enabling collaboration, deeply empathetic, working your way through very complex environments and understanding people and psychology and sociology as much as matter, material choices in whatever design trade you're in. So I think there's that just kind of softens what I was saying about design thinking stuff before, that then as a result of that, there's a way of practicing as a designer, which absolutely has to take people with you. And that's a very different kind of design practice, I think. But I'd argue that equally is something that is a skill or a capability, and therefore, I think could be people, if college degrees in design had that kind of emphasis to it, so you weren't just learning kerning or, roof supporting joists or how to design the drivetrain of a VW, but you were also understanding co-design practice, collaboration processes, organizational theory, little bits of economics, just understanding the drivers people have in their head. That would be a much richer kind of designer as a result. And it would enable them to be more useful in the context of design thinking, actually. Because you'd have a more literate crew to work with, and you'd still have a very strong role for the professional designer as the integrator or the kind of orchestrator of some of those things.
I love that.
Well, again, I haven't really thought about it coherently, but I do think I'm really interested in design education, and I kind of engage with it in different ways. But I still think there's a real opportunity to figure out what's a design education for now that looks at these kinds of issues around design, while still respecting at some point you're going to need a discipline specialist, whether it's architecture or graphic design. The stuff to learn there is important. You understand Joseph Muller-Brockmann and Mies van der Rohe, but it's just it's not enough to do that anymore.
Speaking of design education, that was something else that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because you have taught throughout your career also, and so I'd love to hear a little bit just about your own teaching experience and the types of classes you're teaching, and then are these things you're talking about of kind of including these other things in design education? Have you found ways to do that kind of within the system that exists already, or within the classes, the types of classes that you're teaching?
Yes and no. As in, I have taught a fair bit, as you say, and it's partly in their blood. My parents were teachers, so there was no way I could, in different ways, but no way I could avoid it. And I find it incredibly useful, like I said, in the same way that writing does as well. As in, I also find it personally useful in a kind of reflexive way to understand what I'm thinking about or what I think about. so I find it useful, and in that sense as well, then it's quite exploratory for me. And because I'm not the kind of, when I do teaching, it's not like I've got to, fill semester after semester, filling the same thing, heading towards a master's program, like actual teachers do.
Right, right.
So I can be quite kind of free form and come in and do something and then get the hell out, which
which is the way to do it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I abdicate all responsibility. But anyway, so within that, then I've tried lots of different things, just by definition. So,
Okay.
and I guess I've taught at places also that I find interesting. So, whether that's somewhere like the Copenhagen Interaction Design Institute, which I find an interesting place to then teach that kind of stuff, and in that kind of context, I'm often talking about then cities or urban systems or the wider context of products and how they end up in the world. I'm not really going to teach them about interaction design in that context because they're getting proper interaction design training elsewhere. And then conversely, places like the Bartlett, an architecture school in London at UCL, the sort of first or second best in the world, depending on who makes the list. I'm actually teaching those guys more about interaction design and service design. Okay. So I kind of, it's not done on purpose. It's not like some Machiavellian trick to say, hey, I'll teach them the thing they don't know, and then I'll sound really smart.
Right.
But but it is like, so what's the useful thing to do in this context? And so in the context of an architecture and urban design course, I'm then thinking about user-centered design, human-centered design, service design, multi-touch point thing, strategic design, where the answer doesn't have to be a building just because you're in an architecture course. It's sort of, to begin with, the architecture degree is structured very much around the practice of building, which makes perfect sense. And there's a process one has to go through in order to end there. But at the same time, those skills, if unhooked from building, are massively useful in other design contexts. So I'm then interested in that bit from my point of view. Then you say, well, if you want to change a city or you want to change the way that a city works, doing that by making buildings is a really slow and awkward, cumbersome way to do it. It's like of all the tools, when you're looking at your table in front of you, it's like, go and pick the slowest, heaviest one.
Right.
That's one answer, but it's clearly there are other answers. So I can really help them understand how to open up their thinking. And one thing I've always wanted to do on an architecture degree, and not done yet, but would be to say, how could you affect maximum change in a city one way or another, which I know is a kind of a hubristic thing to say in the first place because a city is sort of out of control. But nonetheless, how could you, out of control in a good way, how could you affect change, not by making buildings, but by just changing the building code? So the building code, again, from my background, with a different kind of code in my head when I say that,
right,
feels like the code that writes the city. The building code defines what setback or massing or height or material choices are possible and which ones aren't.
Yeah.
So in tweaking that, and this is something I learned a lot from Brian, he might have talked about this in your conversation with him around the Low to No project. They really kicked it off, Marco and Brian and Justin, and then I joined that team. But that was super interesting. The most interesting thing for me was actually changing the building code in Helsinki to enable timber buildings, wooden buildings at scale, which was not done by making a building directly. People know how to make wooden buildings. It's just the code stopped them doing it. So we used the fact that we wanted to make a timber building, Citra, the body we worked for, as a reason to have the conversation with the city about changing the building code. Once you have, X tens of millions of euros on the table and say we want to make a building, then it's easier to get their attention. So in changing that building code, you enable multiple buildings to emerge like that.
Right.
Many, many other people can also then use that code to produce timber buildings. So that isn't traditionally thought about from an architecture practice, that kind of how do we enable a systemic change, not by making a building, but actually changing the building code. So that's something that then is, clearly there's a strategic design kind of curriculum emerging in my head. And we're doing some work with UCL at the Bartlett, but in another institute on, basically a Masters of Public Administration. So it'd be instead of the MBA, which basically lazy people do when they have to get some credibility. The MBA does that for you in a way. but it's also widely discredited. But there's no real alternative for that, saying, well, but what about public administration?
Right.
In the MPAs exist, but not in the same way with the same credibility level that the MBA has. So we're thinking about what would a curriculum be around that, and one of the modules I'd be looking at would be strategic design within that. So how do you start thinking in that way, collapsing policy and delivery together, bringing in user-centered thinking as part of that, thinking about this wider set of systemic effects that you can unlock. How do you prototype with policy, for instance? All of these things that, again, traditionally are very hard to do. So there's kind of an emerging thought around strategic design education there, which I think could bolt onto the end of a degree like architecture. Arguably, it would with interaction design and service design as well. Potentially graphic design, although I think it's not quite so attuned to that thinking. I mean, some graphic designers clearly are, but you probably are, but many graphic designers aren't trained in systems. And
well, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, because something that I found when I teach graphic design students, and this is a conversation I've had with a lot of other people on the podcast and with just my professor colleagues, is a kind of future of design education where it isn't just about making designed objects, posters, websites, books, but to start bringing in some of this more system thinking. And it's a challenge both to teach, but also for the students, because this is a very kind of generalized statement, but there's a lot of students that just want to make cool design stuff and aren't primed for thinking like that. And the question I'm getting to, I guess, is, what are your students who might be studying architecture? Is this something to have a class where it's like maybe a building isn't the answer? What's the reception to that, or is that something that's kind of celebrated?
I think it'd probably be the same. As in, I think in an architecture degree, you also have people wanting to make. What did you call it? Cool design stuff.
Right.
It's just that it's different medium, but it's the same instinct, and that's fine. That's totally fine. I think we need posters, we need buildings, we need websites, we need automobiles. Well, we don't need automobiles, but we need bikes and buses, right?
Right.
So I'm fine with that. It's like, how do you get to the 10%, 20%, 30%? Right. I don't know what percent that actually want to go in that way. And at the moment, there's not really much of a place for them, really. They might figure that out afterwards. If you get lucky, like you hang around enough, like me, for instance, then you'll figure it out. If you're like Brian or Justin, I'm talking about Brian Boyer and Justin Cook, they did architecture. They bump into Marco Steinberg as their teacher, who's an architect as well. They end up thinking the way they do as a result. But I would still guess a lot of the other architects in their peers wouldn't have gone that way. So, and it's hard, there isn't really a profession of strategic designer. It's not, you can write it on a business card, but basically you might as well write something in another language, because you're going to immediately get the question, what does that mean?
Right.
Can you translate that for me? So yeah, I think it's not like I've struck a rich seam of students in their thousands and thousands and thousands. But definitely I can see when we teach this kind of stuff, and like I said, it can be in an interaction design context or an architecture context, you're switching the scales and the tools. Right. There's a load of students that start getting interested in that. And that's when I was working at Fabrica briefly in Italy, when I was running that place. That was a chance to think about a school in a very, genuinely kind of holistic sense, really. And it was interesting because there was no certification associated with the school. As in, you went there for a bit, you had a great time, you learned a ton of stuff, and then you left.
Right.
And that's actually pretty much the same model, and I'm not downplaying that. In fact, I'm saying that's the best model. But that's pretty much the same model as CIID in Copenhagen, as Strelka in Moscow, Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam, and so on. Like, I think amongst the best design schools in the world, or design school-ish type things, there is no certification. You don't get a master's or a bachelor's or whatever.
Right.
So you start thinking, that's interesting. So why is that? And because you have the freedom and and capability to do genuinely multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or perhaps even transdisciplinary work.
Yeah.
You have the ability then to switch scales and contexts very freely. You have the ability to address complex problems from multiple angles because you're not trying to pop out a bachelor's in graphic design or an MA in automotive or vehicle design, but something much more rounded than that. And certification doesn't really enable you to do that currently because it's basically on those tracks, which if you look at what those tracks are, they pretty much map onto 20th century, maybe even 19th century contexts.
Right.
And so that I find, sort of troubling and problematic, but also then there's a huge opportunity for saying, so what would a design school be that could shift through scales and systems so effortlessly? At what stage can you do that is an interesting question, because with Fabrica, we pick people up postgraduate, basically. Mm-hmm. So they're already coming as, let's say, a graphic designer with a bachelor's behind them or some years practice to that effect. They were all kind of 20 years to 27 years, 26 years old. But they could have come from a music background, journalism background, an architecture background, a code or software background, and so on. So they already had a kind of a core discipline, and then I sometimes call it like an unfinishing school.
Yeah.
It would then be a place where you could explore. So how does my discipline work alongside that guy's and that guy's, and her there? Like, how does that actually come together as a thing around this complex problem? So that's the kind of school I have in my head when I'm thinking about the answer to your question. It's there are a few examples around pointed out, but it's deliberately running against the way that most education works, or at least it's sitting on the end of it and taking advantage of the fact that basic education is doing the basic education training.
Right.
It's fine.
Right.
So then what?
Right.
Is the question.
I wanna shift gears a little bit. I think this is going to connect to education a bit, but I want to talk about writing because I first came to your work and kind of discovered you through your writing, mostly through City of Sound, your blog that you've had for 20 years or so?
Nearly, since 2001, I guess. So 17, 18 years. It's a ridiculously long time.
And the reason that I bring it up is because what I love about your blog is exactly what you're talking about with education. It's this kind of multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary where you're kind of writing about all of these scales. And so what I'm curious about is kind of how writing fits into your work, or the relationship between that practice of writing to the practice of designing.
Yeah. Maybe following that previous question, maybe you made me think that what I'm doing with the writing there is kind of sublimating my desire to have a design school.
Right. Yeah, it's exactly what I was thinking too.
I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but I think it's kind of, enables me to explore ideas freely because no one's really paying me to do something for them, so I'm writing for myself. It's a very selfish act in a way, but then the nice thing about the internet changing that mode of writing is that then it's in public, and then I guess other people can read it and derive more or less benefit from it. So it is for me basically a very kind of, again, self-reflexive thing. I mean, the writing over time has got harder and harder to fit in, or it's been then built around people commissioning things from me. And so I've then written a lot professionally, sort of halfway through, I guess, the life of the blog. It then became, so I was asked to write this for that, or this for that, or this for this person. And then I used the blog actually to unpack what was going on with the writing, or have the editors cut, that didn't make the journal. Yeah. So it's been a little bit directed by others, but at the same time, it's still effectively a selfish act. But it's a format that enables me to roam freely in the way you just asked about the education.
Right.
And part, as I said previously, because I'm an autodidact when it comes to design, I've always had this very inquisitive kind of spirit around it. So partly because I haven't been schooled in that way, it enables me not to either see the boundaries or not worry about them too much.
Yeah.
So while so while I would read and then incorporate ideas from Joseph Muller-Brockman and Paul Rand and others and so on, I could easily then go and read about, a musician or a politician or a writer or a football player and find something that for me would connect that. And then I found also writers that also write in that way.
Yeah.
I think the other thing there is that, cities has always been this context for my work, and and cities is not something, again, that can be nailed down, and by definition it's a container for other things, basically almost all of human life.
Right.
So if that's your milieu, then it's, again, very hard to draw a line around it. And then to understand that my particular relationship with cities is then, again, not as an architect or an urban planner, but I then end up being called something like an urbanist, which is, again, an equally ridiculous job title, but it's someone whose job is cities. So then, by definition, or whose love is cities, or whose culture is cities. So, and then what? So it's then understanding the relationship between, the cultural life, the economic life, the built fabric, all of those things are part of that mix. It can't be then just one thing.
Yeah, talking about writing for you still largely being something that's a selfish kind of for you endeavor. I have this is a probably reductive, boring question, but because you had mentioned, finding time for it. What impresses me about your writing is how much you do, and that the blog is still like a real blog. Like, it's not a series of tweets. It's sometimes thousands of words. Are you writing every day? Like, what is that practice? What is that like? Do you kind of always have a list of drafts that you're working on? What's that look like for you?
Kind of. Well, I'm writing every day. I write a load in my work. And a lot of my design work, in a funny way, is expressed through a combination of words as much as images. So, I'm doing a lot of writing as part of my job. I do a lot of talking as part of my job. Someone asked me the other day in Australia, so you seem to, give words to people as the output. And sometimes which is interesting because, she hadn't seen all of the drawings. Because sometimes it is also those as well. But there's definitely a large part of it that my output is just words, because it enables me to unlock a different way of thinking about something. You can give someone a drawing and that unlocks it. Some other people might need some words. So I'm comfortable with that. So there's a ton of writing going on all the time. I think the other thing is that I am usually there's usually a set of drafts kind of kicking around, like text files here and there. But as I sort of, again, it's kind of got more and more about these longer form pieces, I've tended to then work on those in kind of periods of things. So I don't think I'm writing anything. I should be writing something right now about high density schooling, and education. But,
interesting.
So I need to start thinking about that this weekend.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a bit like that, but there's always scraps of things around. But it's just like a scrapbook, just like a sketchbook. It's just the same practice in that sense. It just happens to be words into the scribbles.
Right.
And just as with a sketchbook, where you might also paste stuff in there, or you have a Pinterest board. Those text files are also full of quotes from other people, or Insta paper. I have probably tens of thousands of articles in there, which I never read, obviously. But so it's kind of quite magpie-like in that sense, and so the writing is quite incremental and sort of accretive over time. Because I'm not really a proper writer. That's the thing. Like a proper writer can just hit a 5,000 word limit or a 1,000 word limit on a given subject, just like that. Yeah. If I get us to write 2,000 words, it ends up being 8,000 words.
Right.
To cut back. So because I'm not a proper writer.
Yeah. Right. Well, this leads in nicely to kind of my final two questions, because you had mentioned that you have these text files of these things you're thinking about. You have to write about high density schooling. I'm curious. What are the subjects that are on your mind right now? What are the things that are kind of fascinating you and that you're thinking about a lot?
Yeah, that's a big question. There's not much that I don't find interesting in some way or other.
Right. Yeah.
It's crazy. It's, like right now the World Cup is on. I'm a big football fan. Yeah. So all I think about is that. And then, of course, that spins out into the way that team's working is actually a really good management model.
Oh, interesting. I love that.
There's a lot of that lateral kind of thought connection. But no, I think there's something I keep coming back to, which is this sense of cities and the way that they can change. We have a set of technologies ahead of us now as regards cities that enable us to move in a slightly more agile, iterative, human-centered, malleable, adaptive kind of way.
Right.
And I would have liked to have said that about 10 years ago, but it wasn't really the case. But now, because of a funny mixture of very old technologies like the bike, and very new things like autonomous buses, or very old things in a way, like waste composters and stuff, or new things like solar cells, or old things like cooperative building projects, or new things like digital fabrication of buildings. We have this really lovely interplay between the way that cities used to work in this very organic, almost kind of pre-20th century sense, and then this genuinely 21st century pattern to them. And I think that's where with digital design and technology, or interaction design, service design techniques, I'm really just smuggling that playbook into then urban planning and architecture and urban design, trying to anyway, and see what works there. Because part of that is to do with the process. Then you can take this more human-centered, iterative, kind of systems thinking-led approach that is common to us from service design, and also the kind of transformation that goes with that, that's common from the tech world. But there are also bits of kit. So there are new types of spaces, new types of buildings to design. And again, those are, what I find interesting there is this really kind of pulling back to the human or the environmental aspects, which have been difficult to get to the right level of priority previously. And so it needn't be a tech thing. It could be like these amazing cooperative housing projects in Berlin and Zurich and places like that. Arguably Melbourne now as well, where they're just being able to build around the way that people actually live their lives.
Right.
It's not generic buildings as if we have generic people, but it's like
right.
co-design with those people. In the way that when we're making a digital thing, we're trying to make it, specific in terms of product market fit, that kind of language. Yeah. So that I found fascinating, because that, in terms of the value propositions upside down, you have with completely different governance models. You end up thinking about, let's say, what's a 21st century city governance function look like? What's a 21st century city making team? What does it mean to be a citizen or a resident in that kind of city? How do I move around? What sort of work am I doing? Who do I play with? All of those things.
That's so interesting.
I know, it's super good, and that's getting that through in a world of construction of built environments and urban governance and national governance, which is very intransigent and conservative, is really hard. But that seems genuinely interesting, and it can spin out in any number of different directions.
Yeah, I love that's so interesting. My last question, this is a question that I ask everybody, but I'm especially curious because you had mentioned a couple times how you're this kind of autodidact in design and kind of shifting between disciplines. Who are the, if you were to put together a book list or a list of writers who have kind of influenced you or kind of shaped the way that you think about all of this that we've talked about, who are some of those people or some of those books that would be on that list?
God, such a hard question.
Or even people that you're reading right now. It doesn't have to be the canonical list.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the canonical list is too hard for sure. Okay. I do have a set of books above my desk that I go to time and again, and they're a mixture of even things that I don't necessarily fully agree with, but they're just kind of things that are stuck with me. And there's I'll just remember them randomly rather than coherently.
Okay, so it's not, that works.
It's just the spread, but there's a funny things that are sort of almost anti-architecture, like How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brown.
Yeah, I love that book.
Or there's a funny one called Undesigning the Bath by Leonard Cohen, which is about
I don't know that.
Basically the act of bathing as a ritual.
Oh, interesting.
He's kind of originally written from a Californian, slightly hippie-ish perspective, but then it's about Japanese bathing culture, Finnish bathing culture, stuff like that. So this kind of weird mixture of the human experience there. I think Juhani Palasma, who's a Finnish architect, sort of follows that theme, which is about kind of sensory understanding of places and buildings. I think Junichiro Tanizaki's In Praise of Shadows, which is kind of this Japanese classic. So all of those things are about this kind of very sensory or environmental understanding of place. But I'd equally read Le Corbusier, which is sort of the opposite of that to some, but, it's all right. There's a bunch of fiction. I go to a lot, and there's writers that are non-fiction stroke fiction. There's an English guy called Jonathan Rabin who lives in Seattle now and has done for many years. But he wrote a book in 1974 called Soft City, which
I don't know this.
It's really interesting because he's already talking then about the way that the computer might change the city. But for him, there's this very early kind of computer-based dating stuff that was going on there. Like in this 74, no one was going to imagine Tinder at that distance. In a funny way, he was talking about that and how people present themselves on it. And, of course, that was linked to this much longer history of how people present themselves in cities. So there's loads of sociology that I grew up with, which I barely read these days, but I might dip into from time to time, like Henri Lefebvre or Pierre Bourdieu or people like that, which is all about how self and people are complex, shifting kind of mixture of innate character, but then also projected and imagined character and all of those things. So there's a bunch of writers like Jonathan Rabin, maybe Peter Carey, Peter Robb, who do that a bit. I think Rebecca Solnit's work is really in that context in terms of really genuine understanding how cities sort of shift and move. Equally, I'll draw from there's some like management stuff, which I really hate as a genre, but then, a lot of my work has to then think, well, how the hell do we get all of that stuff into the context of boardrooms or city centre, kind of, city government rooms? And then I might look at General Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, which was recommended to me by Marco Steinberg, which is about how do you build these agile, kind of autonomous, functional unit teams, actually drawn from the US military in Iraq, which is kind of fascinating as an organizational model. And then Gillian Tett, who's a financial journalist, but she wrote a book called The Silo Effect about how the problem of silos is kind of played out in terms of organizations and cultures. I chanced across this amazing book by this woman who was walking through Japan in 1878, and a kind of an archived copy of this. Like she must have been one of the first Westerners to do this, because that was when Japan was only really reopening itself. But anyway, some British woman in 1878 just went for a walk with the, as you call it, the indigenous people of Japan. So that's kind of fascinating. And the opposite of, what you think of as travel writing. But I do find that writing about place, Rabin does a lot of that, who I mentioned earlier. It's just endlessly fascinating in the way that you do that. So I guess if there's, leaving aside the management stuff, if there's any kind of theme there, it's understanding sort of culture and complexity of places and spaces and people and the relationship between those things, and digging around in that good old mud. But then I'm an addict for things like The Most Beautiful Swiss Book, 2017. Like, I'm quite happy to read that and look at that stuff as well. Architecture monographs, like anything Japanese architect recently, like Atelier Bauau, Nishizawa, Sana stuff, Su Fujimoto, endlessly brilliant and interesting. But again, I think because of this relationship between place and culture and people. So, anyway, I could go on. But you made it sound like you weren't going to be able to think of any, and then that was probably one of the best lists anyone has put together for this question. That's totally random, because if you ask me in 5 minutes' time, I'll come up with 30 different ones.
Of course. It's always like that. Yeah, I mean, and that list, it was a good mix of some that I was aware of, but a good amount of those I'm unfamiliar with, so I'm going to be adding those to my list. This was such a great conversation. Like I said at the beginning, I'm a big fan of just the way you think about design and your writing. I've been reading you for years and have wanted to get you on the podcast for a while. So thank you so much for this. This was so fun.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for asking. And I really find these conversations valuable personally, and it's good talking to you as well, because the way you've framed those questions, I've rethought actually as I've been going along.
Good.
What the hell am I doing? Who am I?
Good, then I've done my job too. This episode was recorded on July 7th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.